Hi, welcome back. I've got so many questions asking me about pronunciations, what you should work on, how you could improve it, what other things that you should pay attention to. So today I want to tell you everything I know about English pronunciation. Hopefully you will find something useful in here. For me personally, there are 4 essential aspects to pronunciation. And the very first one I've talked about many times, which is the basics. If you want to improve your pronunciation or sound more like a native speaker, this is the part that you cannot skip. By basics, I'm referring to that you need to know how to pronounce every vowel or consonant in English. Not just knowing how to produce those sounds, but also learning the proper techniques. One of the biggest issues a lot of people run into when they're learning the pronunciation of vowels and consonants is that they find it hard to speak the language fluently. They find it hard to connect certain sounds, or they don't understand why the sound here is silenced and that sound is not. And that might have to do with the techniques you use when you're producing these sounds. So knowing the proper techniques, knowing where to place your tongue, how your lips should look like, how your tongue should feel like, how your mouth should look like, all those things are crucial for you to eventually speak English efficiently and effortlessly. Also, we need to familiarize ourselves with the proper stress in each word. We know that that's one of the biggest differences between Chinese and English, where in every English word there is a stress, whether that's on the first syllable or the second, or sometimes on the third or others. So you need to know exactly where the stress is before you're able to pronounce that word correctly. And please don't think that you can skip this step. You have to learn all the basics before you move on to the next steps. You might think that you can skip it for now because you don't want to invest that much time working on singular sound, but rather you want to work on intonation and, sentence stresses and pauses like that. Along the process, you might end up forming some really bad habits in pronouncing certain sounds. And I have witnessed this in some of my students, which could take you up to years to correct later on. So if possible, I would say always start and make sure you have completed this first step before moving on to other things. But in today's video, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the basics. As I said, I've mentioned this so many times previously. Feel free to check out my other videos. Today, I want to talk about what's beyond that. What do you do once you've had a good grasp of all the vowel and consonants? You know where the stress is in most of the commonly used words. What's next? So the second aspect that's very crucial to English pronunciation is the intonation. And that's also where most of you have questions. That's why a lot of you are doing shadowing practice, try to imitate the intonation of another native speaker, try to sound more like them. So before we look closely at the intonation in English, what is intonation? If you look it up, intonation means the rise and fall of voice in speaking. And quite to the contrary of what a lot of people think, the intonation in English is actually quite simple. I know it's a new concept. It's not really that present in the Chinese language. That's why a lot of us are struggling with this. But it's actually not as difficult or complicated as you think. If I have to summarize the intonation in English in one sentence, this would be it. Most of the sentences that you will use in English will be in an overall falling tone. And more specifically, from the beginning of a sentence to the end, there is always a rise and then fall and then repeated cycles like this. And it looks something like this. So what can you learn from this picture? 2 things. First, there are multiple rises and falls in one sentence, in most cases. Second, the overall intonation of most English sentences is a fall, which means if we compare the beginning of a sentence to the end of it, your voice will end up sounding a little bit lower than you were at the beginning. Now, we do have exceptions, especially when it comes to yes or no questions. So in those questions, which we're going to talk about a bit later, we're talking about an overall rising tone. So let's look at an example here first. And feel free to pause this video and read the sentence out loud yourself. Think about how you would approach this sentence and say it in your own way. But this is my version of it. In this video, I want to talk to you about my understanding of how English intonation should be like. Is it very different from the way you would say it? Let me slow down this time. And this time I want you to follow my hand gesture as well when I show you the actual tone that I'm using. So it goes like this. In this video, I want to talk to you about how my understanding of English intonation should be like. Another thing you might notice is that once we slow down our pace, we might notice more of a change in our intonation. So that's why sometimes in movies or TV shows, you might not notice nearly as much of a change in their intonation. You might even think that they're speaking in a monotone. And that's because probably they're speaking really fast, so you could barely tell. Which is why when you're practicing your intonation or your pronunciation in general, I would recommend always do it very slowly. Do it so slow that you almost feel embarrassed even if you're just talking to yourself. That's how slow you should go. Because the faster you go, the less likely you're going to discover your mistakes or any place that sounds unnatural to yourself. So slow it down. And when you're practicing, again, let's use the same sentence. It should sound something like this. In this video, I want to talk to you about my understanding of how English intonation should be like. I know it sounds kind of depressing, but unfortunately, that's the best way for you to practice. That's how I practiced before I was able to speak it fluently or speak a little bit more effortlessly. One thing for you to note too is that before you finish your sentence, do not drop your intonation completely, because that would give people the impression that you have finished talking and they might cut in before you even finish yourself. So always kind of leave it hanging there until you finish sentence, especially when it comes to listing things. So for example, if I want to say, I like many different kinds of fruit, I like apples, oranges, pineapples, and kiwis. So before you get to the very end of your sentence, make sure that your intonation is not yet dropped to the bottom. Now, I just mentioned that there is an exception to this, and that's yes or no questions. When we're expecting a yes or no answer from the other person, by asking them a question, usually those questions would have a rising tone. For example, do you want to go to a movie? Do you like it? Is it great? And things like that. You get the point. But the majority of the sentences that you're going to use in your communication will likely take the overall falling tone. The third aspect that you need to know in order to better your pronunciation is the idea of word group or word unit. You might notice earlier when I was reading that sentence, I didn't read it word by word. Instead, I read it in clusters of word or word group or word unit, however you want to call it. And the reason for that is when we're expressing ourselves, a lot of times our ideas show up by pieces. And that affects our pronunciation as well. Remember, I just said that within a sentence, there will be multiple rises and falls. So how do we decide where to rise, where to fall? That is largely dependent on how you group your words together. Usually, words are grouped together by meanings. So again, let's refer back to the sentence we used before. In this sentence, you can see that I highlight different parts of the sentences to show how I group these words. When I mentioned earlier that there are multiple rise and falls in your intonation within the same sentence, what I was really referring to is within each of these word group, there is a rise and fall. So let me read the sentence to you again so that you can understand what I'm saying. In this video, I want to talk to you about my understanding of how English intonation should be like. And that pretty much summarizes everything you need to know about intonation in English. That's it. It's a simple rise and fall. And the most difficult part for a lot of us might be to be able to speak in word group and attach the proper intonation to these groups. Because we know a lot of us, when we're trying to express ourselves, our words come out one by one. And that will affect how they sound to other people. Because when you're saying words one by one, it's kind of tricky to attach the intonation to them. And this would take a lot of time and practice. I would recommend starting with simple sentences. Maybe you're not even speaking them, you're trying to read them off of a book or an article. Try to recognize how you would group these words and attach the rise and fall intonation rule to all these different groups. It will also feel like you all of a sudden know nothing about how to speak English. But once you practice a little bit more, you'll get used to kind of the rhythm of the change in the intonation, and you'll become a little bit more comfortable with it. And later on, you might even adopt that in your own speaking. And that's kind of how you gradually form your own style. This is also why learning how to use phrases and sentence structures is more beneficial. Because when you need to use them, you're actually saying them as a group instead of trying to squeeze the words out one by one. Last but not least, silence is also important in your pronunciation. You need to know when to pause, when to slow down, and when to speed up when you're speaking. Without the pauses, your sentence will sound like it's coming from a robot. If you find the complete silence really awkward, at the very least change up the pace a little. For example, let's look at the sentence again from before. If I pause naturally within the sentence, it would sound something like this. In this video, I want to talk to you about my understanding of how English intonation should be like. And without pauses, it would sound something like this. In this video, I want to talk to you about my understanding of how English intonation should be like. Does this sound like you? If so, maybe this is where you need to start practicing. And usually for myself, the place where I would pause is in between these word groups. I think that's what makes most sense to me, but then that's more of a personal preference. And also what I forgot to mention earlier with the word groups, same thing. It's up to you. It's really a personal preference how you decide to group your words together. But the most common way to do that is by meanings. For example, if this is a set phrase, you would group obviously the words in the phrase together. But it doesn't have to be a strict rule like that. You do it the way that makes the most sense to you, and same with the pauses. But once again, don't pause for too long, otherwise people might think that you have finished what you want to say and they might cut in. So practice a little bit more, practice to the mirror, record yourself, listen back to it, and then you'll figure out if your pauses make sense or do they sound more robotic. Besides, if we don't pause within a sentence, we can't talk that fast. Nobody thinks that fast. We need time to figure out what we want to say next, and pauses are great for that as well. All right, this is everything I know about English pronunciation, and these are the things that I depended on when I was improving my English, and especially now looking back, figuring out the best way to make suggestions to English learners. Frankly, this is all you need to know about English pronunciation. Once you've got all these 4 aspects figured out, I really don't think you need to take any courses from other people. All you need to do is probably just practice and become more and more familiar with these things, along with any TV shows or movies or other things that you would like to watch on a regular basis. And that's how you better your pronunciation and eventually speak like a native English speaker. So I hope today's video is helpful.